Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jeanne Meister, and I welcome you to the Future of Corporate Academies. I am Executive Vice President of Executive Networks, and I'm really excited to share our latest research on this topic. A special note, I wrote the first book on corporate universities way back in the day, so have seen tremendous evolution over the years where organizations built single-purpose corporate training universities and have evolved that into many new and exciting ways to bring learning where the worker is. I'm joined by Todd Moran, the Chief Learning Strategist of NovoEd. So I'd like to take a moment and invite Todd to introduce himself and say a few words about NovoEd.
Jeanne, thanks so much. It's great to have everyone with us today. I'm joining here from the rather cold and windy Rocky Mountains here in Colorado stateside, but this is fantastic because I too sort of date back in tenure, spending the first 10 or 15 years of my career on the customer side, working basically trying to solve for these large scale sort of workforce transformation efforts. The most recent at Schneider Electric, so understanding sort of the complexities and the nuances, and when we're making investments in whether it's sort of and somewhat now outdated, or we'll put that to the audience today, Jeanne, as things are sort of shifting, of classic corporate universities of old, and what could those be reimagined anew. And that's a lot of where, now my current role at NovoEd as sort of a cohort learning platform solving for some of the most challenging needs of enterprise around digital transformation, DE&I, leadership, and democratization of learning at scale. What could that look like, and what should that look like as we're talking about much broader swaths of the population that we need to serve. And oh, by the way, there's that pandemic thing that we're having to solve for as well, in terms of the blended learning, supporting a blended workplace. When it comes to not a forced return to office for everyone, and how do we serve that population that is much more dispersed across many parts of the world, not just country, for North America. So it's an absolute pleasure to join you today, and excited for all that we have to talk about, and all this research that that is so brilliant.
Yes, thank you. And actually, before we start, I do want to say happy Valentine's Day to everyone, to you, Todd, and everyone that's joining. As I tell my husband, no, it is not a Hallmark holiday. We should take note and give thanks and a special hug to all the people that we care about in our lives. So let's dive into the methodology. We surveyed 515 learning leaders across North America, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. And this gives you a sense of the scope of who we spoke to. We always organize our research by gender, age, country, job title, and then we add a specific question on whether they had a corporate university or a corporate academy. So we want to make this time together as interactive as possible. So we have a few polls, but overall, Todd and I are going to really have a discussion about what we think this research means for you. And we're going to ask you some questions, and we'd like to spur that into a dialogue. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges we see organizations facing. The evolution of what we started with was a corporate university, and that became, in many ways, in the United States and abroad, sort of a repositioned as a corporate academy. And now we're seeing some interesting ways that companies are redesigning and rethinking what this corporate academy should be. And I'll give one example of a member of Executive Networks. And the new scope and audience and increased business leader involvement, those are really our big three takeaways. And then how should you prepare for this evolution in your organization? So let's take a moment to look at some of the challenges organizations are facing. And we had this, on, in a sense, a one pager, right? So we started with the disruption that we've all, excuse me, lived with for the past couple of years. And I'm reminded way back in 2020, when the CEO of Microsoft said they're really experiencing 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months, and that was summer of 2020. That's only accelerated, right, in the last 3 years. And one of the in our research at Executive Networks, where we researched our global heads of HR, what we found was that really for knowledge workers, hybrid working is here to stay. And the real issue is, how do you get it right? How do you move from mandates to really having a dialogue and a discussion about what makes sense, and giving team leaders the autonomy to bring their teams together? And then where do you do this? If you're working remotely, you're not going to likely bring people to a corporate headquarters. So we're seeing the growth of satellite offices, increased use of co-working spaces, and ways to bring teams together. Before we started, Todd and I were having a back and forth from his days at Schneider Electric. I was at their really magnificent learning facility outside of Boston. And I do think for organizations that invested in facilities like this, as well as Deloitte University, with so many people continuing to work hybrid, it becomes even more important to have ways to get them together, so that they can really experience the culture. And let's face it, what people miss when they're home alone working is the energy they get from being with their peers and collaborating with their peers. So the remote, actually, I did an article for Forbes, the top 10 HR trends for the 2023 workplace. And what we found was that remote working and hybrid is becoming so important. I quoted a survey by Zip Recruiter that finds that job seekers would take actually a 14% pay cut in order to work remotely. So people have tasted the ability to work both when and where they want to while delivering their goals, and they want to continue to do that. The second big one is flexibility for all workers. We're just about to publish a really interesting study called The Future of Working and Learning with 1,300 global workers and 1,300 global employees. And one of the things that we included in this latest study was a segment on frontline workers, not just knowledge workers. And so often when we do our research, and this research included, we focus on knowledge workers. But here, flexibility for all workers, and how do we define flexibility in terms of, for frontline workers, it's things as easy as being able to swap shifts with coworkers, or having some voice, if you can, as to when they go into work. And I also think from a learning perspective, how do we ensure learning is happening where the work happens? And that's a big theme of this research. A constant need for upskilling. This is another big takeaway. And as we've seen with the World Economic Forum, something like 50% of the global workforce will need to be upskilled by 2025. And, in all sorts of areas. Again, in my column in Forbes, I looked at some research that Pearson had done, where they looked at what are the key soft skills that people will need to be upskilled on. And these soft skills are no longer soft. That's really an outdated term. It's more human skills. And the human skills include not only the obvious ones with communication and collaboration, but one really important one that has an impact to our research here, and that's learning how to learn. Learning how to learn is really the foundation for everyone as they grow and develop in their careers. And then finally, at Executive Networks, we did a CHRO study where we looked at the Great Resignation was becoming the Great Re-evaluation, where individuals were reevaluating what's important to in their lives, and that was one of many reasons why we saw people leaving jobs and looking for entirely new careers. Well, fast forward to today, where we've had, I think, nearly 200 layoffs between November through February, and I think we're looking at the great resizing. Organizations are looking at what really makes sense, and maybe they were a little too ambitious in hiring. I do think a lot of these layoffs are happening in the tech field, but and in the retail field. So Todd, from your customer base, what are you seeing in terms of the Great Resignation becoming the great right sizing?
Yeah, I think one of the most important themes that is one that's happening across nearly every vertical that we're in support of from our install in our client base, and then two, I think this whole idea of talent, HR, and L&D saying, listen, we could have a stake in the ground to sort of to right that shift, and so it doesn't become exodus and it can become shift. And when I say shift, I think more about a greater emphasis that we're seeing among install based for our side tied to internal mobility. So listen, if you want to give folks the flexibility tied to the remote work, because that's where how they want to approach the workplace, how else can we sort of support their sort of career pathing, career development, if it's not sort of fixed in named position? Because we know that they're constantly thinking about sort of readjusting and resizing. So I think we're seeing this both from the employee side, this appetite and desire to have other opportunities for upward, inward mobility. And then also from the organizational side of things is how can we sort of recast our workforce to sort of meet sort of unknown demands because of this insane pace of change that we've seen the last handful of years. So probably two themes that really come through.
Okay, great. Okay. So what have we seen with a corporate academy or corporate university? And if you have something in your organization, put it in the chat. We'd love to know where you're from and if your organization has an entity called the corporate academy. So what we've seen at a micro level is a movement from training for one size fits all, focusing on the efficiency of the operation, to a personalization of learning and really bringing learning to the worker when and where work is happening. So if you looked at, sort of that movement in an evolution of corporate academies, what are we seeing with specific organizations? And this caught my eye. And actually, on October 17th, 2022, it was a LinkedIn article from the Chief Marketing and Learning Officer at General Electric. And so before we go into what it says, just a moment to pause that GE has combined these two functions, marketing and learning, into one individual. And this individual has a deep background as a CMO with other organizations outside of GE, as well as in the advertising world, and then took on GE Crotonville well before it went through its massive change, leading up to the fact that it became for sale. Having started life in 1956, It then announced in October 17th that it was in fact for sale. And this was, as we were talking, built as a single purpose corporate university on 62 acres outside of New York City, and with a combination of lots of rooms for learning and almost 250 bedrooms, right? So the reason, in addition to GE having been broken up into 3 different companies, was the growing recognition that learning really needs to be closest to where work is happening, on the site, on the factory floor, rather than designating learning for a nominated group of individuals. So in a sense, this is really a shout out to democratizing the entire area of corporate learning. And it's, we see other evolutions happening, but this is by far the oldest corporate university that has, said, the original model doesn't work any longer, for both a combination of business reasons, but really this vision that what we built back in 1956 no longer serves the needs. And this is actually one of the findings that we have in our research here that you're going to see in a minute. So let's talk about some of these findings. And we're going to start with the utilization of a corporate academy. So almost 3/4 of learning leaders either utilize a corporate academy or a corporate university model. And we've segmented them by country, so you can see that here. For our purposes and what we did in the research, we wanted to make sure we alerted you. We defined both of these so people could really think about what this means for their organization. So our working definition of a corporate university was an entity, be it a physical location or an online entity, which really provided learning on leadership and core skills to an employee workforce. And certainly the emphasis at GE Corporate, GE Crotonville, was on leadership for both, for their population, and they also expanded that to customers. For our purposes here, we defined a corporate capability academy as either in-person or virtual, focusing on technical, functional, and business skills. So one of the big examples here that we actually mentioned in the ebook is Coca-Cola Commercial Products created a digital supply chain academy focused on growing digital automation and analytical skills for their supply chain workforce. And they looked at this as being a key business transformation initiative, as a way to upskill this population on digital automation and analytical skills. So it was called the Coca-Cola Capability Academy for Supply Chain. So that's, the example of, another example focusing on technical, functional, and business skills. So the demise, we'll get right into what we thought was a pretty remarkable finding here, and something that we've teed up, and that's the demise of in-person training. You might have seen an article that Todd and I are pretty proud of. It landed in TD Magazine, and as with all articles that are widely read, Todd, it had a great title: Say Goodbye to In-Person Training. And I know when I shared that on LinkedIn, I got all sorts of comments on that, right?
The potential of backlash. There you go.
Potential backlash. But we want to hear from you. So this is our first poll. Do you think about your organization, do you plan to decrease your real estate footprint for learning in the next 2 years. So are you going to be doing that? Yes or no? So actually, we have more people saying no. This is probably my backlash from my LinkedIn posting. But we do have 55% saying yes and 45% saying yes and 55% saying no. So let's share what we learned in ours. And we learned actually that about 59%. So about 11% higher than this poll said yes, that because of the growth of hybrid learning, they did see this as bringing about the demise of brick and mortar corporate learning. So as you're sort of getting a sense and reflecting on this, because it's a pretty big change versus what this audience is saying, let me share an example from a member of Executive Networks. When Todd and I shared this back in fourth quarter of 2021, Executive Networks, for those of you that don't know, is the leading HR peer network. And we have one peer network for every major HR title in a global 1,000 company. And we also have some topical networks. And one of our topical networks was heads of corporate academies globally. So very targeted market here. And when Todd and I shared this, actually, the result of the poll we just did was practically flipped. More people said they were going to be rethinking their physical corporate academy. And one in particular was the head of the corporate academy for Arsenal Mittal, which is a large global steel and mining company. And that gentleman that was the head of, actually what he calls, his title is the lead of the E Academy, said that they're on a journey to rethink their physical facility for their corporate university. And they have a large population in this steel and mining company of frontline hourly workers. And they're starting to experiment with pop-up campuses. Pop-up camp, really bringing the campus to where large populations of learners are, and equipping these pop-up campuses with the right technology to create almost a live studio experience, which is then beamed out to different countries. And, when he was sharing that, I was really thinking to myself, gosh, the potential here is for the corporate academy to be omni-channel, the way retailers are, right? Retailers started just with physical facilities, then the growth of Amazon and other e-shopping, e-commerce sites. And now we see so many of the big brands have both an e-commerce site as well as a series of physical presences, really bringing that shopping experience to where it's most convenient for you. So, Todd, what do we think of the difference here that we're seeing in our results? And I'm going to pop over to the chat for a moment, because I
can pull a few of those forward because I think there's some great observations. One, in terms of this group in its sample size relative to the response, in part, I think Dana and Dina shared a statement around basically, they don't have formal budgets named for footprint of L&D infrastructure. So that might in part sort of account for some of the variance of the larger casting of the original research. But I think Corey brings up a great point, and so did John, is, even though there's maybe been this sort of rather significant increase in this move to digital and focus on virtual, when it comes to some of those human power skills, finding opportunities to bring people together, whether it's in the form of pop-up or an existing structure facility, or maybe there is some type of a legacy campus. I think there's appetite for that, and I think we see it in the greater domain. Whether that's Iger at Disney saying, "Listen, I want people from a creative, innovative, collaborative, power skills back in the office," or David Solomon, in the financial services at Goldman Sachs, echoing those statements. So I think it's not an either or. And I think for folks that are doing this right are going to look for opportunities where it makes sense to bring that in-person component, but you better have the context in the long tail to the omni-channel to weave that over this idea of continuous capability building. It can't just be sort of episodic only. I think that's a theme that we're seeing more of, but would love to hear if others on the line sort of agree or would have a different take there.
Well, first of all, I love the interaction. We have so many people. That's 25 chats. This is what makes these webinars so powerful as a learning experience. I think that our big takeaway is it's and not or, right? And I think the omni-channel example is a really powerful one for all of us. And a few things are indisputable, right? Remote and hybrid work for knowledge workers is here to stay. And so if that happens, a couple of things happen. You're going to look for opportunities to bring people from their home office to some facility for collaboration, for brainstorming, for design thinking. Yes, we can do design thinking remotely on our computers, but it's so much more powerful in person. So you can make a case, as we said earlier, that some of these facilities can even have a growth spurt, if you will, because there's more, but it's really as collaboration, as centers of energy, if you will. One of my other trends for the office was how do we create the offsite vibe on site? And for our learners, how do we bring them together so that they experience the energy from their other team members? Because that's what they're missing. They're home alone. And they really can best thrive with energy. So the mandate for training goes beyond long-term employees. So this is a really interesting finding. And I want all of you to be thinking about one thing here. What's the composition of your workforce today? And where do you see that going in the next couple of years? So here's a poll. Do you plan to expand your training offerings over the next 2 years and check all that apply? Gig workers and freelancers, digital automation workers, i.e. bots, customers, contractors, and workers' dependents, i.e. family members, right? So how broad a scope are you going to go here with with making your learning and development offerings available to any or all segments of this expanded audience as we've just listed them?
Yeah, I think, Jeanne, I think back to just a mere decade ago in my time on the customer side at Schneider, and it was almost unheard of for certain parts of the org to even think about opening catalog offerings, opportunities to anybody who was not a fully badged Schneider employee. And now I think I'm so intrigued to hear how our group today responds to this, because it's part of the collective thought process is, well, of course I have to accommodate these other audiences. How am I going to move my business forward in any kind of meaningful way? So it's amazing in a sort of a short order how quickly sort of the change and pivot there.
I totally remember that, and it was a hard and fact policy, Todd. I mean, we're not doing it. So let's see what's this group thinking. So they're thinking digital automation workers. Yeah, we found that also. And gig workers are the two biggest, and and contractors, right? So this group recognizes the composition of the workforce has vastly changed, and gig workers, bots, and contractors need to be included into the mix. Maybe not so much with customers and workers' dependents. There's a couple of very innovative examples that will go into in a moment. But we want to share with you what we found, right? So by 2025, learning leaders are expected to increase their focus. And so you can see that full-time workers, when we ask them, what's the changing composition? Full-time workers decreasing from 89% to 62%. And look at the increase of, service providers, gig workers, digital automation workers. So I was sharing with Todd that I had an interesting conversation with the CEO of one of the gig platform workers, and what we're beginning to see, and it's still early days, is companies are now stating the total workforce in their 10Ks. And that means a combination of full-time badged employees and gig workers. And sometimes the gig and contractors, especially in technology firms, can be double or even triple the number of full-time workers. So think of that. Think of how short-sighted it would be if you only focused the investment you're making in learning to half or less than half of your total workforce. We're also seeing a movement beyond just focusing on employee experience. You may not be an employee, but you're certainly are taking advantage of a workplace experience. So all of this has very profound implications for the type of learning you're designing, the modalities you select, and being very diligent about the target audiences that can take advantage of this. One of the examples we added, the worker dependents, and those the family units. There are a number of examples that we include in our companion ebook of this research. One of them is waste management, which is now making all their online learning available to their workers' families. And that's a really big deal for families of workers. And I would imagine that they're very proud of that. And if I were an employee of that company, I would be really proud of the fact that my employer is making their investment in learning and development available, not just to me, but to my family. So I think that, I think it's, again, early days, but I would expect more companies that are looking for building a compelling employer value proposition are going to take a look at this. So I'm handing it off now to Todd, and he's going to go through the rest of the research, and we look forward to continuing the discussion, and we're leaving time for questions at the end of this.
Yeah, there's some brilliant dialogue in the chat, so please keep pulling those forward about,
yes.
I think some wonderful observations about the power of the virtual format in terms of that angle of inclusive sort of nature, and now being able to cast a net that reaches and approaches so many more than saying, you can't make it to the corporate office, or you can't get to the satellite facility. So that comes with some challenges and risk. But this other theme that I think really stood out from the research and would invite folks, we're going to share a poll here in just a minute, but this idea of not only is, you would say, is the business involved in learning, but this just really heightened component of anchoring and driving it forward. And I think this is a theme that comes through, and excited to hear what people think today. We saw 82% of learning leaders in all these regions across the next 3 years recognizing a notable, significant increase in business leaders. And maybe one of the examples I can share kind of is from some of the clients that we work with. I take Cemex. This is the largest building materials manufacturer in the world, some 50 countries, 40,000 employees. They re-envisioned a handful of years ago their entire approach to their corporate university, all digital, and basically anchoring around effectively 8 core academies inside their overarching university. And rather than make L&D the anchors and HR and talent the drivers, they appointed and anointed the leads inside the business to be the face of these. So it's Ben Nichols, the head of cement operation, is anchors that academy, and the power in that, in the way that Jeanne, you spoke about Coca-Cola and their supply chain academy is massive, because not only are they being asked to contribute to both sort of some of the delivery components, the content creation, the experience creation for folks, but they're also the face of this. So it's tied to work. It's not, oh, learning is something we do differently with that department. It becomes part and parcel. So I think that was an intriguing one. And as we play forward some of the research pieces here, I think the other one that stands out that we wanted to share with folks is Caroline Advances, was this poll. What are you thinking about in terms of this idea of, if the business is taking more of a concerted focus in learning, does that mean we have to report like the business? So having to basically cascade metrics around the function of L&D and how that's contributing back to the business. How many of you might be thinking about doing something like an annual report, because this was one of those ways where we create that tie back to the business. And whether that's now or in the future, would be so intrigued to hear, because I think this one maybe, Jeanne, would you say that caught folks a little bit off guard, or maybe you all, in terms of question wise?
It did catch, but I've seen, this is a clear trend, and it makes so much sense, right? As we have business leaders more involved in the value of learning, and they are expecting to have to be a report out, and have the report out in the similar language that they're used to seeing with other functions. So think about how not only how you would answer this question of publishing sort of a learning annual report, but think about how you're reporting your value and metrics back to the organization today. And what might you be doing differently over the next couple of years? But let's see what the results say, Carol Ann. Okay, well, that is real. Thank you. Thumbs up, right? Big smile from Todd.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've sort of the classic sort of long-awaited, we want a seat at the table. You've got one. Now justify its position. And the annual report in part goes to that, right? Is that you're not just sort of relying on smile sheets and ENPS survey results, but basically saying, what's the definitive impact to the business? So this is brilliant to hear folks at 58% saying yes, they're doing that, and almost 20 saying no, but there are plans to do that in the next 2 years, which I think that cascades wonderfully to sort of our next stance, which was, of the survey set of the 500 plus, Jeanne, I think current state nearly half. So this group, that's a group of overachievers at 58% versus the 50. So that's you're ahead of the curve, which is great to be thinking about.
Thank you. So now in the chat, because if I were in your spot, right, Todd, if I were on this webinar today and I was someone that said, actually, we don't have an annual report, we don't have it in the works. Gosh, I would like to know, what are you including in your annual report? Tell us in the chat. We want your voice in this conversation. What are the key themes? What's the outline or the infrastructure? What are you focused on reporting? What's your, in a sense, management dashboard, right? Companies have dashboards to report out their results on a monthly basis. What would be the dashboard for the learning annual report that you're considering putting in there? So Todd, what would you contribute to one item for this learning dashboard?
Yeah, I'm going to do two. I know you asked me to do
one. Okay,
I'm going to put two in there.
Like the rest of this bunch.
so I think there's obvious ones when you think about sort of global approaches of where universities can come into play, or the L&D function. So obvious pieces tied to things like, from an onboarding perspective, and be specific. This is important. So if it's the nature of sort of retention or sort of rate of turnover being reduced in sort of first year associates, those pieces are obvious ones. But there's also also others, depending on industry. I think of the Cemex example, spun up explicitly their health and safety, and Marco Rodriguez saying, listen, we're going to measure two critical things to the business, and we're going to prove the worth of this deployment and investment in this academy around gross reduction in incident by site, by cement operation site in field, and obviously a really critical one, which is just an overarching safety metric and measure that can be highly correlated. You might not be able to claim causality, but high correlation in terms of reduction in any kind of severe workplace, accident. Those are meaningful, both from a fine perspective, industry regulation wise, but also sort of the sentiment and perspective of that organization, across all of Mexico. So, a couple things you want to be thinking about. I think the more specific you can get to the areas, so if it's operational efficiency or retention or sort of safety entities, definitely important ones to think about.
Okay, good. I'll throw my hat in for, I would start with, how's the target audience for your learning changing? Like, who are you directing this to today? And, that poll that we saw, right? It's, you're going to cast a wide net, and how wide is that today? And where do you see that going in the future? So the target audience question. I also think because we know internal talent mobility is so important. What are we doing from a learning perspective to ensure that people vote for more mobility? How what are we doing to move people through and help them learn and grow in new positions? So I do think there's an internal talent mobility piece. Anything in the chat that before we leave this, Todd?
Yeah, I thought Liz had some great ones. Just, there's part of this is a coverage aspect, right? Because in part, if you're moving to a bit more of a lead with digital mentality, being able to say, listen, we've been able to, the breadth of reach for the population served, a little bit where you were going, Jeanne, I think is important. Yeah. Frequency, and I think that's a really important measure, right? It's not that, did you get through the once a year compliance training kind of legacy metric of old, or are you doing a continuous development? Hey, we have a leadership sort of hypo program that has this many touch points across the consistency of a multi-year program, or a technical program for our engineers that does the following. So that continuous sort of capability capture and frequency, I think is a big one that came out of there. Okay.
So some thoughts for you as you think through this in greater detail.
Yeah, so for the 19% of us that on the group today that sort of said, listen, we don't have it, but over the next 2 years, we will be thinking about it. You're in shared company. So, taking some of the input from Jeanne and myself, obviously there's some great thoughts in the chat there too, is, definitely put it on your radar. I think it's becoming more and more of a sort of requisite ask as opposed to a nice to have coming out of L&D in years ahead. And I think, Jeanne, we had maybe one last poll for folks, if I recall here, that we want to think about. So come back and maybe think more broadly. Jeanne opened with this idea of, WEF and sort of by 2025, what are those critical skill areas that you're trying to ascribe to? And obviously one of the meta of all meta, the ability to continue to learn on that front. But where are you putting kind of your big bets from a skilling perspective over the next 2 years around developing net new competencies across your workforce? Or is it really about tied to this, hey, listen, let's keep the talent we have, but let's reshuffle and address sort of the needs of the business, and that becomes more of a reskilling? Where might you be putting your big bets if we forced you into a choose one or the other? Yeah.
This is definitely one of those forced questions, right?
It seems unfair, Jeanne, that we're doing a forced ranking
unfair. Here. It does.
Because I think that you could make an argument strongly for both of these, but at the end of the day, you all have already had to allocate budgets and where you're making investments in content and platforms and outside facilitators, perhaps. Where are you directing your sort of L&D entities in terms of support of the business?
Oh well, they were forced and they answered.
Really intriguing, and maybe part of this is the sense of recognition for the folks around today in different industries of radical change that has happened and is going to continue to come. So the need for new competencies and sort of new capabilities takes front and center stage, as opposed to smaller adjustments of sort of recalibrating one's workforce. If that's how folks answer this, would be great to know. Is it the daunting nature of what's coming for you and your business and your sector and your vertical? But that's an intriguing one on that front.
I think that from this results, Todd, what we are seeing the growth of these corporate capability academies, which address this first issue, right? Growing the functional, technical, and business skills of the population, like the Coca-Cola example. So, how does learning fit as part of a business transformation issue? And that's why we have more business leaders involved in the learning agenda, because they see it as a critical way to address some of these big changes that they see happening in their industry, that they need to put a stake in the ground. So I can see why people have chosen that one.
Yeah, John, and I love your stance about you've long been a believer in learning agility, that which the sort of WEF entity back in 2020 identified as being sort of this critical sort of meta skill of all skills. Active learning and learning strategies, I believe, is the way that they frame that. But watching that cascade to others beyond leadership, I think, is going to be an important one. So I think Jeanne, we had 3 others to sort of leave folks with before we can certainly open the floor further. But how we want to sort of, if you were to take nothing more than these 3 things away, this would be maybe your focus.
Yeah. So the first one, be mindful of these multiple stakeholders, right? It's not just full-time employees. And we think that also with ESG, becoming really an important issue, that another dashboard issue that companies are going to report on. They're going to want to be able to say who has been who's taking advantage of the investment they're making in learning and development. And again, if we see so much of this with the growth being with digital automation workers and gig workers, we simply cannot exclude them from the learning and development opportunities that you've created today. It makes no sense. And I don't think, Todd, it made sense 5 or 10 years ago. I remember when I heard companies say they had a policy, no, their library was closed to anyone that wasn't a badged employee. It didn't make sense then. And now it really is short-sighted. So it's multiple stakeholders. It's increased involvement with business leaders will drive your ability to report out in a dashboard, the contribution that the learning and development investment has made to furthering the strategic priorities for the organization. And yes, I believe that is some type of learning annual report with a dashboard, just like we report out business results on a weekly basis. And then finally, we are mindful that all these new solutions come with yet another platform. And how do learning leaders have also told us they need to make sense of all of this and be sure they're all integrated. So Scott, do you want to continue on here?
Yeah, that certainly you get this idea of the broader audience, I think, is an obvious one, as you mentioned, and then document and justifying the investment opportunities that you've been given as L&D, HR, and talent leaders become obvious. But I think this last one's an important one, and for a long time, there's this sort of claim of personalization, and often that took the very narrowed lens of content personalization. It's sort of just enough, just in time, just for me, and not that was the sort of ill-fated pursuit for organizations supporting their business, But I don't know that that's the right level of personalization. When I think about personalization as evidenced by some of these academies we've spoken about, or working with, one of if not the largest aviation entity in the world, who's doing a corporate global upskilling, reskilling, which I've heard a lot of folks in the chat saying that's so important, is the nature of that personalization is not individual pursuit of I want to learn these things. It's what does the business need you to know and execute with greater operational efficiency in field. And that's a different level of personalization. And I think it's important to recognize sort of the meeting, whether that's through process or new tool sets or new systems that you're putting in place, is the sort of the melding of personal individual pursuit. I want to be my own CLO and learn XYZ relative to what is it the organization? Yes, they want to develop you. Yes, they want to keep your skills and talents. But at the end of the day, we have to perform as a business. So what does that mean in terms of personalization at scale? And I think there might be a need for other systems, tools, processes as part of that assessment.
I think this notion of personalization at scale is what you just said, really critical. And really, how do companies deliver on that? Because that, and I'm thinking of our example with the pop-up campus, and at the heart of it, they were, taking the learning closer to where the workers were globally, but they didn't just pop up a physical facility. They created the technology so they can live stream at scale in local languages where they are taking these pop-up campuses abroad. So I think that one small example, shared this vision of we want to bring learning to where the learner is, but in addition, we want to have it equipped with the technologies so it could be scaled in local languages. And that's certainly the dream of this company. And I would think it's got to be the dream of a lot of CLOs out there.
Yeah, and I love Dorothy makes a wonderful kind of closing statement in the chat about a really heightened emphasis on this idea of more longitudinal design of learning journeys, allowing for that sort of in-role assignment. And whether or not language is part of that, Dorothy, I'd be so intrigued. But certainly that's something that we're seeing a lot of that demand of listen, if you want to cast digital and you want to scale so that you're not having sort of isolated populations, but let them execute in native language of choice, because it's so important to be able to execute the day-to-day business. That's a challenge. Can technology help with that? We believe so, certainly. And there's a lot of things that we're doing on that front of content translation that looks beyond just the UI, but into the nuance of the richness of what's being cascaded to audiences. So great point there.
Yeah, and people really want to learn in their native language. I mean, that's where they feel comfortable, right? And without question. Yeah.
And I think if you could finding ways to sort of combine that with this sort of, can you still put folks in aggregate for that sort of cohesive experience across entity? Because at the end of the day, we're social beasts, and in many ways sort of learn powerfully in a social setting. That can be powerful. At times that's been challenging for folks. You're bifurcating libraries and content assets and a legacy LMS, but I think it's a noble pursuit, and one that you should be asking all of us on the provider side to be doing more for you and more with you on that, in that regard.
So you bring up a great final question, Todd. What should CLOs ask their providers for now that we've learned, now that we've been able to share our latest research? What's the one or two things that you're being asked from some of your clients and or prospects as they pull together a strategy for learning and development for their organization?
Yeah. Can I do two again? Can I buck the rules here?
Because you're an overachiever. We know that.
No, I'm just verbose. Don't conflate the two. It's dangerous. So here are the two that I think, and maybe one becomes very obvious. But as you all are thinking about, good Lord, do I have to bring another piece of technology into my system? The answer is perhaps yes. So the ask is then let it work seamlessly from an ease of deployment, the ease of integration, the pass back of data, the seamless flow of information. So even if the experience is going to be in different systems, there's a sense of continuity for your workforce or your expanded workforce, as we've pointed out today. It's not just badged employees. So that's probably the biggest one to be pressing, is listen, you can't operate in a siloed, isolated environment. And so open, I think will be sort of the focus du jour, if you will, for providers. The second, and maybe this is a less obvious one, because we're bringing and asking the business to be closer to learning deployment, let the tools and processes that we equip them with which to deliver learning and training be far more easy to execute upon. So this idea of, creator-like platform, it's a big tenet of what we're driving at NovoEd, is that you don't have to have this sort of brilliant masters in instructional design and experience design to put forth, phenomenal programming and experiences on a platform to reach, tens of thousands of individuals. Let empower the business and equip them that way. So I think you're going to see two themes on the integration front and on sort of the ease of creation and deployment being sort of part and parcel of an ask that you should be making of your providers across the board.
Mm-hmm. Are you hearing anything about ChatGPT?
A lot, certainly a lot. And I think that, I would say that so many folks, I just read a great article this morning from Sal Khan saying, at least in sort of the K through 12 and higher ed, I think it'll make its way into corporate too, is do not ban it. He's taking a really hard stance in terms of the founder of Khan Academy I think there's great power to be had by it. But if anything, I think in sort of the early days of what OpenAI has put forth, there's this recognition that if anything, we need to put greater emphasis on the human connection. And I think I saw that in some of the chat early on, Jeanne, as you were stepping through, this hyper focus on the criticality of sort of the human connection, the human element, and sort of that social side. Because as effusive a sort of authoring and writing tool as ChatGPT can be and is effective, I think it's going to, widely miss the mark when it comes to the ability of sort of the human components. And that's an important piece, especially when folks are feeling, 3 years on into pandemic, this sense of disconnection from one another and from the org. Yeah.
And I didn't see that article, but I want to, because as a parent, what do we know? Anytime we ban something, happens.
That's right. You just drive them more towards it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like human nature. So it's really pretty obvious. We have any other questions before? We definitely would love to continue to engage with you. My email at Executive Networks and Todd's at NovoEd, and reach out to us for any other issues, questions, or ideas you might have. Any other questions in chat that we should be addressing, Todd?
I think we got to them all. I love Lior's great take on the finality of GPT is, with any tech, don't ask it to be used to do stupid, unnecessary things at a rate that's faster than it can scale, which is good feedback for all of us to be thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, again, have a great Valentine's Day, and thank you for starting with us.